morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. My name is Maarten van Aalst. I'm Director of the International Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center and Professor Climate and Disaster Resilience at ITC, University of Twente, the Netherlands. I'll quickly be taking you through the main conclusions of the IPCC Working Group 2 contribution to the 6th assessment report. Let me share my screen. Obviously, I won't be able to do justice to everything that is in the report. It is a massive undertaking that took several years to complete. The work of 270 authors and almost 700 contributing authors, summarizing more than 34,000 scientific papers. The report went through several review rounds with over 62,000 review comments that were responded to line by line. And then last month, we ended all of this with the summary for policymakers being approved by all UN governments, line by line, so that what we end up with here is really not just a reflection of all the science, but also a consensus among all governments of what that science represents. And I'll give you a snapshot of that in the next 10 minutes, but please go to the full report to see the wealth of information that is collected there. And that wealth of information is a pretty bleak picture. The main headline conclusion is this: the scientific evidence is unequivocal that climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and that any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. When, with my team in the International Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, we were devising a way to tell the story of this report to general audiences, we commissioned cartoonists to briefly describe its main conclusions. And this was the sort of overall catch cartoon for what the report was, an atlas of doom. It looked, well, it's actually not funny at all, but it is an apt description of the bleakness of the report, echoed on the day of its release by the UN Secretary General Guterres, who actually called the report an atlas of human suffering. But I want to emphasize that it's not all just bleakness. The report is also about solutions. What can we do to adapt? How can we better deal with the rising risks that are coming our way? But importantly, of course, also, and that's what the recent Working Group 3 report was about, it adds to the urgency of still reducing emissions, because we can still limit temperature rise from going to the levels where we see that the risks are really getting out of hand. Okay, let's take a look at those main conclusions. The first is that the impacts are already dangerous and widespread around us today. And it includes disruption in nature, such as these dying forests in California, but also impacts on the lives of billions of people around the world, despite efforts to adapt to what's already changing around us. And everyone is feeling that today. We estimate that over 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change today. And in that sense, we are seeing that climate change is already affecting people, but of course, not just because of what's changing in the climate. It's a combination of those rising risks from the atmosphere and the ocean with how we are shaping risks by other patterns: poverty, inequality, unsustainable use of natural resources, and increasingly urbanization, where assets and people are being concentrated, sometimes in highly vulnerable places, and not always taking into account the risks even of today's climate, let alone how it is changing. We have an opportunity here to reduce risks rather than just see them rise as they have often been today. In places of high vulnerability, climate change is already contributing to human. Here is that the potential is that the current impacts actually aggravate vulnerability to future shocks. And that links to a more broad pattern of risks becoming more complex and more compounded. Whereas originally people thought of climate change as a predictable thing for the future that we could just anticipate and adapt to. Say 10 centimeters of sea level rise, you add 10 centimeters to a seawall and you're back to the old level of safety. What we're seeing around us clearly is that risks are getting more complex and compounded. And that includes combinations of hazards that are more difficult to manage. So in the Netherlands, for instance, my own country, we thought of sea level rise, and then we were confronted with increased runoff from our rivers. So we needed to create more space for those rivers. But then suddenly 2 years ago with a very hot and dry summer. So suddenly instead of getting rid of the water, we actually needed to keep the water in. But what we're also seeing increasingly is that those risks are cascading through sectors and regions. So for instance, failed harvests in one place, leading to rising food prices, and then food insecurity in other places. We've seen all around us the massive shocks translating through global supply chains after COVID in these recent years, but equally with climate shocks. And we've seen that with the floods in Thailand 10 years ago, for instance. And importantly, what we're seeing now is that responses themselves are becoming risks. And we're seeing that with maladaptation, where some solutions may work for one hazard, but not for another, or may work for a while or for limited extremes, but actually increase vulnerability to bigger problems or longer term trends. We're also seeing winners and losers. For instance, if you do irrigation to keep agriculture going somewhere upstream, and you're taking water away from people downstream that are also facing rising climate variability. So all of those patterns of maladaptation are becoming a bigger concern, and we're already seeing more of that happening. But we're also seeing side effects of mitigation, for instance, biofuel production that may compete with food production, but also affect biodiversity. And of course, the same question around risks of solar radiation modification are also raised in the report. This complexity of risks is an increasing character of the climate risks we're facing today, making it harder also to estimate quantitatively what exactly we're facing. But the concerns have clearly gone up. And that then also means that the risks are worse than we thought before. And every small increase in warming increases future risks. These are the infamous burning embers that for unique and threatened systems, extreme weather events, the distribution of impacts, but also the global aggregated impacts, as well as the risk of big tipping points, large-scale events that can really dramatically alter the climate irreversibly, where we looked at how these risks are evolving. And compared to our previous assessment 7 years ago, all of these risks are coming at us faster than we thought before. So temperature has continued to rise, greenhouse gases have continued to accumulate in the atmosphere, committing us to more continued global warming. But also at each level of global warming, each of these risks is coming at us faster. And importantly, many of these risks are facing limits to adaptation. And that's particularly depicted by the purple, which was only evident in 2 of these bars in the previous assessment, but now becomes visible in all of them if temperatures rise, certainly above 3 degrees, but in some cases already above 1.5 degrees. There will not be any ways to adapt if we reach those high temperature levels. And that has huge implications in terms of heat stress, water scarcity, food security, flood risk. We're talking about severe risks to human well-being. And there are many actions we can take, and we've seen them being effective. We've seen them taking place. And a good example are early warning systems, for instance, that have saved millions of lives over the past decades. That action has increased, but the progress is uneven, and we're not adapting fast enough compared to how fast the risks are rising. And importantly, as I already showed you with the burning embers, there are limits to adaptation. Even effective adaptation will not prevent all losses and damages in the coming decades. Above 1.5 degrees, some natural solutions may no longer work. Similarly, lack of fresh water could mean that people living on small islands, and in cases of dependency on glaciers and snow melt, people may no longer be able to adapt in those places. And by 2 degrees, it will be challenging to farm multiple staple crops in many of the current growing areas. These are severe risks that will at some point become unavoidable. And their impacts will be particularly severe for the most vulnerable. Again, this is one of those cartoons interpretations of what the report is saying. Of course, not an IPCC illustration, but it signals that in many cases where people have the resources, they'll be able to adapt much further and faster than people already suffering the consequences today. And it also means that action is highly urgent. There is a question about what we do in light of the evidence also coming out of the IPCC Working Group 3 report on mitigation this week. What we do about the temperature trajectories by keeping greenhouse gas reductions, by reducing greenhouse gas reductions much more quickly than is happening so far, to make sure we can still stay on those temperature pathways. But equally, we must better manage risk. It is not good enough to just count on development as usual, keeping people safe from the increasing shocks that we're already seeing today and that we're expecting in the future. And once again, some of the current shocks may aggravate vulnerability and thus increase vulnerability to future shocks. And that means that if you're in one of these downward paths with rising temperatures and rising risks, you may not be able to get on the pathways towards climate resilient development at all at some point. And this is the short window of opportunity that we were describing about, which is both about the temperature pathways that we must protect by reducing greenhouse gas emissions quickly, but also the development pathways that we must choose in how we build our cities, how we divide up the resources in the world, and how we collaborate and govern the risks that are facing us now in almost all sectors of society everywhere on Earth. Again, a bleak picture, but also a picture of hope in terms of those solutions still being available and at our disposal. But it requires transformational change in many sectors in our society. Let me leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand over here to my colleagues who will take you into more detail on carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. Thank you.